Today we're going to record a pretty short demo. This end-to-end we realized doesn't take an extremely long time once we knew the correct steps to get this done. But the goal of our session today is to demonstrate how to deploy an instance of the OpenEMR, open source medical record software, to an Azure app service with a MySQL flexible server backend. And we're going to be doing that using the web app plus database offering available in Azure. There are a couple of tips and tricks, I would say. There were a few things that took us a little while to figure out how to get this to provision correctly. The biggest one is the setup step that's necessary after you provision the web app, where the OpenEMR software goes through a pretty lengthy script internally to configure the backend database if that doesn't exist already, which in our case it doesn't. We're going to start from scratch. So we'll hopefully be able to provide a decent example of how to quickly navigate through that and get things up and running. So without further ado then, I'm sharing my screen over here, and I've got a new blank resource group. I provisioned my resource group for default of East US, but pick whichever region you feel is closest to you. And we'll go ahead and create a new resource. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I was just saying, so the end result of this is going to be an entirely PaaS-based deployment, correct? We're not going to have any virtual machines. We're not going to have any containers or anything. Like this is
Exactly
100%
right.
PaaS Azure.
Yep. That's a great point. You know, there is some decent documentation with OpenEMR on their website and in their repos around containerization and maybe deploying it to like Kubernetes cluster. They even have some decent scripts around doing that. But what we found there is, you know, although that's pretty easy to get up and running, you know, if you're not someone who's familiar with managing Kubernetes clusters, you know, that might become a pretty difficult task for you then kind of on day two, right? Like, how do I manage my cluster? How do I back up the persistent volumes and the disks and databases and so forth? So we felt that this was more of a lightweight setup, although there are those few kind of tricks that I mentioned to getting it to actually install and get it up and running. The resulting resources you have then are a little bit easier to manage if you don't have that Kubernetes experience. So that was our ultimate goal, is try to create something that's the least cost as possible, but it's still running in the cloud. It still gives you some flexibility and scalability, and it's easy to manage. So if you don't have a large IT department backing your organization, this should be pretty easy for you to get up and running.
Very cool.
Yeah. Okay, so I clicked on create new resource. I typed in web app in the search bar for the marketplace, and then I will select the web app plus database option. This is what will automatically configure a MySQL flexible database server for us that's already connected to our web app, so we don't have to go through the extra tasks of doing that. So I'll click on that option. There it is, the first one that comes up. Web app plus database. We'll go ahead and create an instance of that. And then we just have to fill out the options that we want here. We'll give our web app a name. This does have to be unique across Azure because it does generate a fully qualified domain name for us in the Azure websites.net namespace. So hopefully I can pick one that hasn't been used already. Yep, we'll just go with OpenEMR demo. That's fine. The runtime stack, this is selecting which underlying capabilities will be available to our app service. So I'll scroll down the list here and pick PHP. We've had success with, I believe, PHP 8 and 8.1. We're not sure. We haven't fully tested with 8.2 yet to see if that does work with the current version of OpenEMR. So for today, for the purposes of this demo, I'll go ahead and select 8.1 since we know for sure that will work. And then under the database section, we'll just go ahead and pick our options for that. MySQL flexible server is fine. I'll leave it with the default name. I'll go ahead and say basic. You may want to go with standard. That gives you a little bit more horsepower there. If you did want to pull this out for production use, that would be a good option. But for today, a basic instance would be just fine.
would be good then if I just want to be able to kind of click through things, see what it looks like, but it's not necessarily going to have all the horsepower, be quite as fast as
Yeah,
production and
exactly.
support as
Yep.
many users, right?
Yep. Yeah, so this would be great for, we're kind of creating a demo here. So it'd be good if you just need to demonstrate to some stakeholders how it works and show off some of the features of the product, or for development purposes, you kind of want to keep your costs to a minimum for the development instances of OpenEMR. So that'd be a good option there as well. Okay, I can give it some tags if I want. Again, this is just Azure stuff here, no big deal. If you wanted to apply maybe a tag that you could use to kind of filter out these resources, if you're searching for them later, you could give it a tag if you want. I won't do that today. And then we get a nice summary screen here in the portal that says what it's going to do. It kind of verifies that we filled everything out correctly with the options, and it looks like everything did validate. It does give me a username and password for the database here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that out to a notepad file I have over here on my other screen, just so that when we're setting things up a little later, we remember what the username and password is without having to reset those things. So let me just do that real quick. I'll grab the root username and then grab my password. All right, looks like I've got that. And then we'll let it go ahead and create. So that'll take a few moments to spin up and create that. We'll maybe try to clip the video a little bit so we don't have to sit and wait for that.
While we're waiting on that to deploy, do we want to go ahead and go show where we can go download the OpenEMR software that we're going to be deploying from?
Yeah, that sounds good. Okay, so I've got a link here. Let me copy that out. So yeah, the next step that we'll want to do is we need the source files for OpenEMR, which again, it's an open source product. All the code is out there. You can just download it. So I've got a link here where we can download the source files. This is an installation guide that they've provided on their website. If we were to install this to just like our local machine, so a Windows machine, or if you did have like a virtual machine running someplace that you wanted to install it on and it was a Windows server, this is the guide you could follow to do that. But they provide a zip file here that you can use to download the source for that specific version. We're going to target the 7.0.0 released version, and it's a little bit cleaned up. So if I were to go out and just clone the GitHub repo, there's a lot of kind of extra files that are out there that you would want when you're developing and maybe making changes to the source code, but those aren't all necessary if we're actually doing production install of OpenEMR. So they provide a zip file that we can just go download, and it's a little bit cleaner. So you can click on that and download it. I'll go ahead and do that and then open it up, or I'm sorry, I'll extract that to a folder. So I've already done that a little bit earlier. And then what I'll do is I can open up that folder in VS Code. So you can see here, these are the source files. There still are quite a few out there, but these are the source files that we'll want to use then to deploy to our app service once that's done provisioning. So let's go through a couple more steps here. You can see I've kind of got my script of our demo today listed out in the install steps. We'll also publish this in a blog post that accompanies this video. So if you want to follow along the steps that we're using, you can do so using that. So we've already downloaded the zip file, we extracted it, and now this next step, I'll want to wait until our database is done provisioning, but I need to go grab the certificate file that's generated for our MySQL server and include that with the source files for OpenEMR. So what this means is we want to create a secure connection on the back end from our app service to our database. And the way MySQL does that is it generates a public and a private certificate, and it gives us the ability with that MySQL flexible server to download the public cert, and we just have to put that in a known location for the OpenEMR app so that it can establish a secure connection with our MySQL server. So as soon as that's done provisioning, I can grab that file. There is one other thing that we'll want to do, and this is one of the tips and tricks that I mentioned at the beginning of the demo to get this to work, there's this kind of large installation script that has to run when we first create the app and connect with the database and so forth. And what we found is if you try to run that just through the web interface as usual, app service will time out. So it starts executing a web request essentially, and that script starts to run. But before it's able to complete all of the installation steps in that script, the app service times out, and there's really no way to get around that. So what we decided to do was see if we could find a way to kind of run those installation scripts out of process, if you will, not through the web interface of the app service. And luckily they do provide that capability. So what I'll do next is I'll go into this path right here. We've got an installer auto PHP script file that's available in the source files. So you can see I've got the path listed there. So it's in my contrib folder, utils, install scripts, and it's this installer auto PHP file. And what I need to do is they kind of realize like, hey, this is a pretty powerful file, and technically if somebody knew the location of where this was on your server, they could execute this and it would potentially ruin the current installation of the app that you have. So what they did is they put sort of a short circuit built into the script right here on line 78. Normally this is not a commented line of code. So essentially before it actually gets to any of the code that it'll execute, the script is set to short circuit and just exit so that you can't run this installation script. However, we want to do that today in our demo. So what I need to do is just comment out that exit line, and then I'll be able to execute the script out of process that is not in a web request, and that will go through and do the work of setting up our database. So I'll save that file so that it gets deployed correctly. All right, let's go back over and see if our web app is done provisioning. It's not quite done. Go ahead, Dave.
I would say it looks like we're still waiting on part of the database deployment.
Yep. So we'll give that just a few more moments.
While we're waiting on that, if we want to bounce back over to VS Code, one thing to point out, and it's noted in our file here, but if you go back over to your preview demo.markdown or your demo.markdown file, we do use a particular Visual Studio Code extension in order to publish that web app. I think it'd be great if we could show which extension that is over in our extensions tab in VS Code
perfect.
Really quick.
Yep, let's go through that while we're waiting for that other resource to finish provisioning. So as Dave mentioned, we're going to have to deploy these files out to our web app in Azure. And what we're going to use is an extension for VS Code. And I think it's under, is it App Service or Web App?
I think it's Azure App Service is what it's called. And it's by Microsoft. Yep. It's published by Microsoft, and it's just called Azure App Service.
Yep. So here's the one that we're using.
Flexible extension.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So I've got this one installed and activated. And what ends up happening now is you can see I've got my toolbar on the right. I think by default in VS Code, you would see your toolbars over on the left-hand side. This is just a preference for me, but the point is you'll see a new section here. Once you start to install extensions that have access to Azure resources, you'll see this Azure section here in your toolbar. So if I click on Azure, you'll get a couple of different sections within the blade for this Azure toolbar. And you can see kind of the big one is just, it gives me access to all of my Azure resources. So what I need to do is the first time I install this extension, you won't see anything here. There will be a button that says you need to sign in to Azure. So as soon as you authenticate, I'll take you through the whole process. It actually does pop open a web browser. So if you have like multi-factor authentication configured in your environment and everything, that's no problem. It walks you through all of that. And then based on the account you use to sign in, it will show you, well, here's the list of all of the Azure subscriptions that you have access to. So today we're using a demo environment that our team has access to. So I'll pop that open. And then you can see that under our subscription, we've got some different resource types here. So the resource types that show up are based upon the specific extensions that I've installed. So because I installed the app service extension, you can see I get a list of those right here. And now I can interact with those via that extension. So it'll show me a list of all of the app services it found. Let's see if that one is there yet. I don't believe it is. I might have to just refresh it and see if it'll pull that in.
I think you've got a refresh option right at the app services level as well.
Yeah, I didn't know if it was performing that. All right, we'll get it to reload that and just have it refresh all our resources. And then once that new web app shows up, I can simply use the extension to deploy my source files as a web app directly to that app service. So it makes it very easy, kind of similar to the like right-click deploy if you're used to that in like Visual Studio or something. Makes it pretty straightforward to just get some source files deployed out to an app service.
Yep, but that'll work for more than just PHP as well. That'll work for your function apps if you need to do that and test them that way. That'll work for your ASP.NET MVC or web APIs. So we've got a lot of flexibility with that.
So there you can see that OpenEMR demo, that new app service node that we just created now appears. And if I expand that, you've got a bunch of different options. You can even see, because we created this as a web app plus database, it's showing database connections that are associated with it. You can modify app settings or see what those are. You have access to the underlying files and logs and everything. So a really nice way to be able to interact with that right from VS Code and not have to, be jumping back and forth between the portal and your web browser. All right, let's go see if that resource is done. And it looks like it is. So we'll head over to our web app. All right, so now we need to deploy the code. So let's go ahead and do that. And I can simply right click on this app service. And because I've opened up my VS Code folder to the root of...
Pause for just a second. Dave. I think we wanted to put our certificate in our code before we deploy.
Thank you for doing that. Otherwise, I would have had to do that again. All right, let's go find that quick. Right. So what Dave is saying is, because we want that certificate available for the web app to be able to connect with the database securely, we have to go grab that. Now that the database is done creating, we'll go grab that from our MySQL database in Azure, and then we'll put it in a known location in our files before we deploy them. So let's pop back out here. Whoops, I meant to go into the resource group. There we go. And here's our MySQL database that was provisioned. And if I click into the, let's see, was it under networking or connect? It might have been under connect. Trying to remember where I got this from now. Yep, there we go. So I went to the networking tab and then just download the SSL cert. Cool, so I can save that file. It doesn't matter where you save it initially because it needs to be renamed so that the OpenEMR application knows which file you're talking about. It expects it to be a specific name for the certificate file, so we can go ahead and save that. And then we'll rename it and copy it to, let's see if I can remember where I'm putting that. It's going to go into my sites folder right here, sites/default. And then let's see, we go into documents and then certificates. So in the documents, certificates folder, let me double check and make sure that's where I want it to be. Yes, we want to add that file in there. And it looks like right now I've got, this is the name of the file that we had downloaded from the server. So I am going to rename that file. Let's see, it's MySQL CA, and there's no extension on it. All right, so we'll confirm that's what we wanted to do. Yep, MySQL-CA with no extension. that should be your certificate file, and that's where it needs to go in that location.
And that's specifically because the code that's written in, or the OpenEMR code that uses that SQL connection is looking for a file with that name in that directory to open that connection.
Yeah, and we weren't, we like I said, this was kind of one of the tips and tricks that we had to figure out to get that to connect appropriately. And maybe there is a way to get it to use a different file name, but there are several places where the code makes a connection to that database. And each time it does that, it's testing to see if this known location has this specific file in it. So we thought that was probably easier just to rename that cert file rather than having to go through and find all the different places in the code to modify the source code to update that. So that's what we'll do.
Makes sense.
All right, so let's hop back out here. We find our app service again. So now I can right click on it. I can say deploy to web app. Again, it's just going to assume that I want to, the root folder that I have open in VS Code. It's saying, hey, is that the application you want me to deploy? Yep, let's go ahead and do that, and we'll deploy it. Okay, and with the magic of video editing, we are back. So we waited a little while for the zip file to complete creating. We used the app service extension in VS Code to do a deployment to the web app that zips up all the files and then uses the web deploy feature of Azure App Services to publish all the contents of the file. And if I scroll back through the logs here, you can see all the files that it was processing, and then finally gave us a message that it finished doing that successfully. And then if we browse out to the app service itself, I'll go back to our resource group here. Here's the app service. And we should see under the deployment center section that, we had a deployment that happened and it was successful. So that's should be your experience once it does finally finish creating the zip file and publishing to the app service. So now that we have the files up there, we want to be able to run the installation for OpenEMR. And as mentioned earlier, that's again another one of our tricks that we had to figure out. If we just browse to the site right now, it will by default detect that the installation has not yet run for OpenEMR, and it'll take us through a setup wizard. So normally that's the path you would take if you were installing this on a VM or on a server machine. However, when we do this through app service, the problem becomes it takes a little too long for that script to run ultimately, and it times out and never completes. So what we did is figured out a way to go into the app service. We can actually sign into using the advanced developer tools available with app services. We can sign into the terminal of the machine that's hosting this service and execute that installation script ourselves so it doesn't time out. So there's a pretty quick way to get to that. I'm here again in the app service. I'll scroll down and my menu's on the left. We'll get to the advanced tools or the Kudu tools. We'll go into that. This gives us kind of the behind the scenes, if you will, or like the hosting site for our app service. We can access things like the log files, and if we wanted to actually browse and see the files that were deployed to the site, we could do that here as well. But let's see if we can get into the SSH terminal, and then we can show you how to execute the installation script. So here we go. The connection is established. And I'm going to actually change directories to where I know that installation script file is. That'll alleviate me needing to type all that out in the path when I execute the script, but it also will help me confirm that all the files that I'm expecting to be app service machine here are indeed where I want them to be. So we'll just take a look. We should have a site there.
And while you're doing that, Phil, it might make sense to mention we chose SSH because it gives us this root user you see on the left.
Yeah, exactly. So, yep, we could have done, there's kind of two options that you saw there. I clicked on SSH. We could have clicked on bash. When you sign into the bash terminal here, you're signed in as like the app service user, which doesn't have full root access to the machine. And therefore, we're not able to execute some of the things like the PHP script command that we need to do to run the installation that way. So by going in the SSH route, we do get root access, and we're able to execute and get access to the things that we need. Let's see, I believe it was under contrib, right?
Contrib, and then there should be an install. Yeah, util, then install scripts, I believe.
There we go. So this is the file that we're looking to execute. And I do have that statement prepared already, so I don't have to type it all out, but we're just going to call the PHP execution engine there, and we're going to pass in some parameters.
And then let's pause for just a second before we copy and paste that in.
Sure.
We're not going to paste in that entire command that Phil has there.
Yeah, you can see I'm only highlighting part of it.
Yep. Yeah, the script itself defaults to using OpenEMR for the login and password. That's something, though, that you as a user would probably want to change those default values just from a database security standpoint. Phil, if you want to open up that, we can go look at that file really quick maybe and just kind of show what some of the
I was
defaults
just heading there now. Yep.
are
So if I open up that installer file that we're going to try to execute here, again, this is the one earlier where we had to make sure we commented out this shortcut statement, the exit, so that it will do the setup work for us. After we successfully run this, we either want to come in and put that statement back in so that somebody doesn't accidentally find this and run it again and kind of overwrite our install, or possibly delete this file altogether from your instance once the install is complete, just so that it doesn't step on the configuration that you have. But as Dave mentioned, if you scroll down just a little bit past that, you can see here are all of the incoming parameter options that you could pass into this on the command line. We're only using a few of them, but because they do have some defaults defined here, but you could definitely supply your own values for all of these if you wanted to. Right now, I'm just using the root login for the MySQL database and the password there so that we can get access and be able to provision the database and then execute the scripts to create all the tables for the system. However, if we wanted to override like the database username, for example, that gets created as part of that process, right now it's defaulting to OpenEMR. You could supply your own values there. And we also have this I user. You can see that on line 85 right there. That's just an admin. This will be the default administrator user that's created for OpenEMR itself. So when we go try to sign in to the user interface after this is complete, this would be the admin username and password that we use. Again, these are just defaulting to some well-known values for our demo purposes, but you may want to override those values in your environment and set them to something a little bit more secure.
We're not going to really cover here where some of those parameters are more relevant if you're doing like a multi-instance install. Right. That's out of scope for this conversation, but just be aware that there are some parameters related to that are available.
Awesome. Okay, so here we go. I pasted in the command here and just double checking that looks good. So let's try to run that. And you don't really get much information here or progress updates while it's running, other than the prompt hasn't returned yet with an error or any message otherwise. So that means that it is running. And another thing we can do is if I go back over to the Azure portal, we'll go back to our resource group that we created and look at the server. One of the first tasks it does as part of that script is it has to create that new database for us. And I believe the default is just OpenEMR. So if we look at the database here, switch down here to databases, and we should see that there is a new database created. There was a default one in there created earlier. This one here, OpenEMR demo database, that was provisioned automatically when we created the web app plus database through that marketplace offering we saw earlier. We can just ignore that. We could delete that database if we wanted to. The point is our installer script that we're running right now has provisioned a new database for us in the server. And that's this one right here, the OpenEMR. So that's a good way to check and make sure that it's connected and actually doing work. So again, this should just take a few minutes to complete that. And then once that's done, it will update some configuration files in the OpenEMR app, and we'll be able to browse to our app and sign in and confirm that everything is working as expected.
And the most likely error that people would see when they're executing that script is the inability to connect to the database.
Yep.
So that could just be an incorrect credential. It could be we didn't put that certificate in the right place, that OpenCA.
Yeah,
or,
exactly right.
MySQL-CA certificate that we had shown a little bit earlier. So it's not able to connect over SSL. Those are probably the most common troubleshooting tips that we've run into while we've been working through this install.
Yeah,
and
I
it
would
will
say,
give you that
if
failed
you
to
do
connect
run in,
error message pretty much right away.
Yeah, exactly right. It'll kick that back. Another option you can do is on the MySQL database server, under the configuration here, it'll be under this section called server parameters. You can disable the SSL on it if you want to. And I think the easiest way to find it, there's quite a few parameters here. You can see like many pages of server parameters that are available to configure it. I think if we just search for SSL, yeah, here it is right here. The second one on the list on the screen right now, require secure transport. That's currently set to on. If we flip that to off and then save our changes, that will disable the requirement that you need to connect with SSL. So that's another way that, hey, I think my username and password are correct. I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong here, if it's the certificate or what have you. Maybe just come out and flip that to off and try it again to see if now you can connect, just to rule that out, and then, come back and deal with re-enabling it later. But obviously that wasn't a problem for us. We had our cert in the right place and it was named the right thing. So it should be done in just a few moments here. Cool. So it looks like our script has completed. I believe that's all we have to do for the app to be up and running. So let me switch back over to the web app and we'll get the URL. So we'll try to browse to that and see if we can get the site to start up here for us.
And
Great.
there's a site.
So this is great news. You get this initial toast pop-up message to register your email address with OpenEMR and get updates and so forth. So we'll just say no thanks to that right away. And again, we've got that default username and password that again we could have overridden if we supplied those values to our installation script. But I'll just pass in our defaults there and we'll confirm that we can log in and get to the welcome screen here, or the entry page for OpenEMR. There you go. We've gone through how to provision a new Azure Web App Plus database. So you end up with an app service and a backing MySQL flexible server. How to grab the installation files for OpenEMR from their website, open them up in VS Code, made a few modifications to update our installation script, and then also how to grab the certificate file that we need to connect securely with the MySQL database server. We use the app service extension for VS Code to then push those files up to our app service. And then we showed you how to securely connect via SSH through the Azure portal into that app service and run the installation script, which again is one of our tricks for avoiding the timeout when running that initial installation. And then finally, that results in a functional OpenEMR running on an app service in Azure.